welcome everybody to Soil Builders Education in Action, what you can do to protect the Lake Champlain Basin. I'm Natasha Duarte, the director of the Composting Association of Vermont. And this webinar is is organized in partnership with the Friends of Northern Lake Champlain and Franklin County Natural Resource Conservation District. I'd like to start just by thanking my project partners, Athena Lee Bradley, Mark Companion, Chuck Dupre, Brian Jerose, Deb Neher, and Ellie Ventura, as well as giving additional thanks to our partner organizations and the Composting Association of Vermont's Board of Directors, who've been really great about providing insight and overview for this project, which is funded by the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission in partnership with the Lake Champlain Basin program. So big thanks to them as well for making this project possible. For today's workshop, I'm going to give just a short overview of the Soil Builders Education and Action program, so you sort of understand how this one workshop is situated amongst this whole project that we're working on. We're going to cover the connection between soil health and water quality and the impacts of land use on watershed function and what can be done to restore function. And then we're really hoping that we're going to spend a bit of time, maybe half an hour or so towards the end, to talk about next steps. So this is great information, but what can you do to put some of these ideas that we're going to be presenting into action to make them work for you? And I just wanted to touch briefly, just because there's been a lot in the current news. And so I'm sure you've all seen the algae blooms closing down lakes and swimming holes, which is a real bummer. Southern part of the state got upwards of 5 inches, causing really serious damage to a lot of the infrastructure, major erosion. I know I'm in Heinsberg. We've had 2 pretty major hail events here this year, which is pretty, like marble size hail, which is thunder and lightning, sure, but hail is a little unusual for us. And in spite of all of this big rain, more than half the state is still experiencing moderate drought. And so we're going to be talking about how all of these things fit together, how they relate to water quality concerns, and what you can do to start addressing some of them in your backyard as well as in your community. The Soil Builders program and workshops, we originally were hoping to have them in person, and that we've pivoted to do these workshops in a webinar format. For now, we may have some opportunity in the fall, hopefully, to maybe do some small in-person workshops. But really, it's to make those connections, connect the dots between compost, organic matter, soil health, and water quality, and to provide compost-related eco-literacy for Lake Champlain Basin decision makers, professionals, and advocates. So just folks living in and impacted by water quality issues and soil health issues in our communities. So talking about the specific benefits from using compost and how to modify current practices to produce those benefits. We've already had workshops, sort of an introductory or 101 workshop on soil health and water quality, one that addresses some of the drivers for clean water and healthy soil, sort of looking at it from a regulatory point of view and understanding some of the science behind what's driving these initiatives. And then most of the content has been in these best management practices. So really hammering home the idea that not all compost is the same. And you'll be hearing a lot more about that tonight. But then also looking at, road issues and erosion control issues, or practices for landscape architects, for watershed groups, for agriculture. So we're sort of doing these deeper dives into different segments. And then we're always focused on education and action. So now that we know this, and we've known a lot about this for a while, how do we actually put it to use for us in our own communities and on our own property? And the recordings are all cataloged on compostingvermont.org/soilbuilders. And so all of these, you can always go back and look at them. And we're trying to also collect a number of resources that are related to these different modules and have them there for easy reference. And so with that, I am just going to pass it off to Deb Neher, who is going to start taking us through the connection between soil health and water quality. Deb.
All right, thank you. Good evening. So soil can certainly be part of the problem that we're talking about when it's mobilized and goes into the lake. But soil itself is a huge reservoir of moisture and nutrient storage. And really, this whole connection comes down to the management and how we interact with the landscape. And so this evening, I'm going to present some overview of some basic soil concepts and how they relate to water quality. So first, just to get a little bit of background in terms of what we're talking about. So what is soil? And on the left-hand side of your slide, you can see this is actually a slice through real soil. And the tan-colored particles represent mineral particles, and the organic matter is the dark portion, and the blue there represents the open spaces. And essentially what we can see is there's a lot of open space. Soil is really a porous fabric. And over on the upper right-hand side, you can see that, actually the soil is about half solids and about half open space. And the open spaces are habitat for soil organisms, the soil biology. In the lower right-hand side, we can see an illustration that describes the different sizes of the solids or the mineral particles within soil. The solid portion is really a mixture of different particle sizes, with clay at the top of that triangle is the smallest in size, and the largest in size is sand, which is illustrated in the lower left-hand part of that triangle. And so soils are mixtures of these different particle sizes, and these mineral solids really originate from weathered rock that was reflecting the chemistry of bedrock. And the source or type of bedrock underlying these soils really influences and affects the pH of soil, as well as the amount of phosphorus found in the soil, because phosphorus, the origin of it, is from rock. Now, farm soils in Vermont can be either extreme, from very high in clay to very high in sand. And understanding these soil properties is really critical to understanding soil erosion and reducing soil loss. Soil is alive. That's why we call it soil and not dirt. Another nice term for it is it's really the living skin of the earth. And in fact, more than 40% of living organisms in terrestrial ecosystems are associated with soil at some point in their life cycle. That's 40%. There's, for every teaspoon of soil illustrated on the left, it can hold as many organisms within that teaspoon of soil as there are people on Earth. And the soil food webs illustrated on the right-hand side of the slide are very complex. There's a series of different positions within the food chain, and we have interactions between these different levels. And these food webs contribute to ecological processes, including decomposition and nutrient cycling, which are really essential to food production, as well as purification of soil and water. So what is healthy soil? In Vermont, we now have a definition of healthy soil in the statute of the Clean Water Act. And I know some of you were involved with that effort. This statute contains the following attributes. First, that soil is it's well developed and it has a porous structure. This porous structure is what improves water infiltration and retention, and it also serves as the habitat for the biology, the biota, or the microbial communities. Chemically balanced is inferring and relating to pH, the acidity of the soil, as well as nutrients. And a healthy soil has an abundance of organic matter. And it's this organic matter that's providing energy for that whole food web. It's holding moisture as well as nutrients. So let's put these together. The soil health and the water cycle are connected. And this is a busy slide, and I'll just try to unpack it. And on the left-hand side, we can see precipitation starts that. So we have the precipitation, and that water or snowfall is going to infiltrate if it's a porous soil, and then it will eventually make its way deep into the groundwater. That's what we want. However, if soils happen to be compacted or have a crusted surface, we'll see more runoff on the surface of that. And with that runoff, it'll erode and it'll carry sediments as well as nutrients, and those will then go down to the surface waters. Now, if we add mulches such as compost that are high in organic matter, this can help reduce that erosion by dispersing the energy that comes in from those raindrops, and which will help slow down the water and allow it to soak in. Now, also in this picture is vegetation, and vegetation is also an important component here. We see grasses and trees, and vegetation serves two different roles. First, the roots of those vegetation help stabilize the soil. And secondly, by getting the roots into the soil, this helps break up and reduce compaction. So by having vegetation there, the net result is really facilitating infiltration and helping to reduce the erosion by holding that soil in place and ultimately protecting the water quality. And so by adding compost to the soil, this contributes to the organic matter. It also adds life to the soil, not only improves soil structure, but helps to prevent runoff that can pollute rivers and lakes. What is organic matter? We often link compost and organic matter. So let's understand what organic matter really is. Organic matter is basically dead and decaying plant and animal residues. And these residues contain carbon, which end up supplying energy for the living microorganisms that are residing in organic matter. And there's also fractions of organic matter that can really range in terms of how easily they're degraded. There are some that are very easily degraded, and then there are other carbon components that are very resistant to decomposition. And organic matter profoundly affects soil properties and the function of soil. And I'll name a few of those ways. One is organic matter helps with water retention. It helps soil act like a sponge so that it can hold, it holds more water and it will hold it there in place. And organic matter is also one of the ingredients that helps to form what we call aggregates, which gives soil its crumbliness, kind of the crumbles or fluffiness, and which helps stabilize it to reduce or prevent erosion. And organic matter is also a reservoir and storage for nutrients. And it can be holding those nutrients inside the clumps of organic matter, but on the surface of these organic matter components are exchangeable nutrients. And I'll get into that a bit in 2 more slides. So let's look next at what is compost. Compost has a very precise definition, and I'm just going to reiterate some of the main points. And you can always go back to module 2 to get the deep dive and details. But compost is produced by the process of composting. And this is a managed and controlled process of decomposition that's really governed by biology. It's the organisms doing the work. So therefore, when we make compost, we need to think about making sure those organisms have ample oxygen and moisture to do their work. And so one of the things that's really definitive about compost that separates it from, say, anaerobic digestion is this oxygen component. Compost requires it to be an oxygenated environment where anaerobic digestion is without oxygen. So once these organisms are active due to the moisture and the oxygen, they're going to generate heat, which is their respiration. And with that, we will see carbon dioxide, which is a product of respiration, as well as water vapor. And that's what we're seeing, that heat and that water vapor coming off of the windrow there in the photo. And this heat is really important. We need to reach a threshold of a high temperature so that we get a good kill of pathogens and weed seeds. And that's an important phase. So in contrast to anaerobic digestion, AD is done in the absence of oxygen, and instead of CO2, it's giving off methane or natural gas. And it also can kill pathogens, but it's not the heat that does it. In anaerobic digestion, it's really the absence of oxygen. that's causing, that will kill pathogens. So in the process of composting, this will help reduce the volume and mass of the raw materials considerably, and it results in a solid, stable, and mature product that's really rich in organic matter. The qualities of this product really depend on the recipe and the method in which we make this compost. So some of the advantage of the process of composting is this is really helping to support local organics diversion from the landfills. In landfills is where we see that they become anaerobic, and this can be a source of methane, odors, and leachate. And we can avoid this by composting. Besides, we can keep, these resources locally available for soil improvement and fertility through the application of this product. So if we do composting properly, it is not a source of noxious weeds or invasive pests. So keep in mind that heat phase is really the part that is designed to kill these pests. However, I must mention that in a backyard situation, it's nearly impossible to really reach those that high of temperature that you could reach in a commercial operation. Okay, so let's tie it all together. Compost is regulating nutrients and water. And illustrated on the upper right-hand side is kind of you can see kind of the surface of organic matter. And note that the surface of organic matter, they have net negative charges here. And those can act like magnets to nutrients. Nutrients have positive charge, so opposite charges attract. So therefore, with more organic matter, we have more sites where nutrients can attach, and this increases the nutrient holding capacity of soil. And this is improved by the addition of compost. Compost also contains microbes that are holding nutrients in their bodies as proteins or fats, and those tissues are then converted to plant available nutrients when the organisms die, and this offers a source of kind of slow release nutrients. So available nutrients are then dissolved in water, and so therefore managing the water flow really helps manage nutrients. They go hand in hand. So overall, compost and organic matter acting like a sponge to hold water with this high surface area of this porous matrix and indirectly managing nutrients. Healthy soils equals healthy plants. It all gets back to the plants, and we're thinking about food production as well as, other plants that make for healthy landscapes. And healthy soils support plants by providing nutrients, the physical structure to hold up plants and for their roots, as well as the water availability. And the schematic on the right kind of summarizes the direct effects of the application of organic amendments, and those are illustrated with the black arrows. Generally, we see the addition of organic amendments increasing soil quality, so that's the soil side, but for plants, it's increasing the crop yield, both by promoting the plant growth directly, as well as indirectly by disease suppression, kind of suppressing pathogens, and also reducing weeds and their invasion. So compost allows soil to be looser. This allows it to hold more air and promote better root growth. And organic amendments will improve water management, which improves infiltration of the precipitation to groundwater and provides resilience. And this gets back to the point Natasha was making about some of these extreme events. Resilience is super important. But compost will help a system be more resilient, make plants more resilient to drought. And which is very important in terms of relation to climate change and the increased frequency of extreme events. Compost increases the nutrient holding capacity and regulates the release of nutrients according to plant needs, and prevents excess nutrients from leaving and becoming a pollutant. Finally, compost contains beneficial bacteria and fungi that can antagonize or compete with disease-causing organisms and therefore help provide some biological resistance. If some of you are familiar with the whole human gut analogy, the same thing kind of happens in soil. If you have a lot of diversity here and you have all these beneficials, they help keep the bad guys in check. So this is kind of my summary slide, and we kind of tie it all together, looking at the relationship between healthy soil, compost, and water. By understanding soil properties, it's critical to understanding soil erosion and reducing soil loss. Healthy soils can be a reservoir for moisture, organic matter, carbon, and nutrients. However, when it's disturbed or degraded, the soil cannot retain water and nutrients, and that's where compost can come in and help. One key to a healthy Lake Champlain ecosystem is provided by developing healthy soils to restore native species habitat, nutrient retention, flood resilience, and sediment retention. So we're going to have an upcoming session where we take a deep dive into soil health, and that's where we'll really get into the nitty-gritty of the components of soil health and how management impacts those factors.
Thank you so much, Deb, for that background on soil. So now I'd like to invite Brian Jerose to take us through the next part of our webinar.
Great. Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Natasha. And thanks, everyone, for joining us this evening. Just to kind of transition to this next section is to talk about the ways that some of these compost-based best management practices are applied in different parts of our landscape and watershed. So we've got the range of a forested setting, which covers a large part of the Missisquoi Basin and northern Lake Champlain. We have pictures of the developed landscape, roads and such leading up to our shorelines, got other natural areas, and then obviously agriculture being another significant land use. This next illustration is just a schematic of a typical water cycle within a watershed. And we represent that well in this region. We have those lakeside communities. We have St. Albans and Swanton, much closer to the lake. Then we work up the valleys, Missisquoi and Rock River and Lamoille, and ultimately up to the northern greens. We have quite a range of precipitation amounts, as little as 25 inches a year of combined snow melt and rainfall down near the lake, all the way up to around 75 inches average of precipitation along the higher ridges. So that mobilizes a lot of water, but it also affects how much pollutants, and phosphorus in particular, moves off of the landscape. So there's a combination of the source of the phosphorus, which could be everything from lawns and street runoff to fertilized and other crop fields with manure, to a less fertile landscape up in a forested mountain alpine landscape. But when you have the heavy rains or the frequent rains, that's what mobilizes all of those nutrients potentially into the wrong place where they can feed algae and weed growth. So the next few slides are some examples locally and elsewhere of where soil management has not necessarily been ideal. The picture on the right, for example, is in Enosburg. Great location, actually. The Enosburg Recreation Fields, kind of across from Hannaford's, if folks can picture that. But during the phase when that was being developed, maybe 15 years ago, it was bare at a certain point before being mulched and revegetated, and heavy rains came and overwhelmed the silt fence. The sediment washed through there into a nearby stream, and then not too much further into the Missisquoi River. But you can see that the erosion control practices like silt fence were attempted, but in these settings, when there's such degradation to the soil, they can be overwhelmed and become ineffective. More of an agricultural setting, but it's been common practice and guidance to really work the soil in order to prepare a new seed bed, particularly with grasses or small grains. But think about the soil being tilled multiple times to break up that tight clay and then packed to get the fine seed bed. It may work at times when all the weather and soil moisture conditions line up, but that makes the soil extremely vulnerable. It both breaks apart a lot of that soil biology that's present in the top layers of the soil, but then when it's vulnerable to those heavy rainstorms, the soil can get pulverized and form a crust and then no longer infiltrate as we would like it to function. I like this picture because it shows on a zoomed in scale what happens when we don't have mulch, compost, vegetation, cover crops, or other growing plants protecting that vulnerable bare surface. You think of a small little drop of water not being a big deal, but if it's falling from 30,000 feet, it builds up quite a bit of energy and then can break apart that soil and those aggregates, the good crumbly texture, and instead smear it and then crust it over as it dries. And an illustration of that, just again, if we've got the grass on the left or other soft open soil surface, that rain can infiltrate in, get down into the deeper soil layers, eventually into groundwater. Again, aggregated soil being those nice clumps, or not clumps, but more a crumbly texture of soil. Whereas on the right, the runoff, the soil surface is sealed over. The aggregates have broken down, it seals, and unfortunately the soil, which could be a huge sponge, instead acts like a parking lot or another impervious surface, and then that runoff starts to carry soil, manure, phosphorus, and other nutrients into nearby drainage ways and ultimately Lake Champlain. And this is an example of that happening in practice right here in Franklin County in the Missisquoi Basin. So the field had been in multiple years of corn silage, didn't have any cover crop this year. Heavy rains came and that tilled soil left bare no longer had good capacity to soak in the spring rains and snow melt. The point of runoff leaves the field into a roadside ditch, not too much further into a tributary of the Black Creek. I think this picture illustrates, I'll credit Ben Gavis with the phrase of 10,000 little leaks. It's not like we have a toxic factory in Enosburg or Sheldon belching out, millions of gallons of pollutants. It's really a lot of these little small points of runoff carrying phosphorus, sediment, and other things off of the landscape that's sometimes been fertilized or given manure, and then carrying that downstream where it has those negative impacts. Some other examples, which are certainly visible in this region. The example at the left, I think highlights what we wanted to emphasize of riverbank and in-channel erosion being one of the significant sources of phosphorus in the Missisquoi Basin loading that was identified. So there's phosphorus that is attached to those soil particles in the bank and the sediment in the channel. And when that is eroded away through the lack of woody buffers at the edge of the stream, or again, these more powerful, larger storm events, combined with the fact that flows from upstream areas or higher in the watershed that haven't been able to soak in that water leads to these bigger flows carrying sediment that scours away the channel and the bank and causing a chain reaction of mobilizing that sediment nutrient downstream. And then another example on the right of just how driveways, impervious surface, people trying to do drainage around their house to not have wet areas with mosquitoes or otherwise, can then oftentimes in these big storms lead to mobilizing sediment. Again, it sometimes goes onto our town roads and ditches or otherwise right into stream. So slowing down that water and getting it into the ground rather than having it run off is at least part of the way to think of we could address some of these issues. And this is an extreme example. I believe this is Route 4 near Killington after Hurricane Irene. So that massive storm mobilized even a larger magnitude of sediment and water, and the power of that scouring clearly is a huge risk to human life and infrastructure, but also mobilized an enormous amount of sediment and nutrients into Lake Champlain and other water bodies. So we and really lots of people have been looking at this. So to kind of frame this in the stormwater management, This has been started to be adopted, a range of practices around the country, and some that we'd love to see more of here in Vermont. Thinking about the historic practice at the edge of a new store with a large parking lot, a lot of the focus historically has been building big detention and retention basins at the edge to just capture that water so that it doesn't overwhelm the nearby ditch and stream and create those channel erosion issues. But in practice, what more of these stormwater management strategies are doing is mimicking nature. So trying to restore those soil functions around these physical structures to help them function more effectively. And again, focus on those infiltration, evaporation, and transpiration aspects of the water cycle. In Vermont, there has been recent updates to permit requirements. Long, slow process, but it had resulted in some good positive changes that are still being rolled out and implemented at different paces across the state. Some of them are related specifically to erosion prevention and sediment control. Again, I think some of it involved reducing the size of lots that were subject to permits that required these practices. But within that, what we thought is notable is the post-construction soil quality requirement. So if a soil after being disturbed had only 2% organic matter, the specification now is to raise it over 4%. So the idea is to create more of a sponge, again, more storage for that runoff and precipitation in the soil and not have to depend so much on the physical structures for detention, retention, and drainage. There was also a requirement associated this with municipal roads. We also know that back roads and all roads are points of pollution, as simple as oils and other things off of cars, but we put a lot of sand and other material on for traction. And then they also, after these heavy storms, can gully and erode themselves. So there are a set of practices with the Better Back Roads program or Vermont local roads programs that deal with these and build soil practices around them can make all of them much more effective as well. So getting into the specifics of, again, how people have applied different compost-based products in these applications, the three categories that we'll spend a little time on are these erosion control blankets, so more or less functioning like hydro seeding or mulching an area to protect that vulnerable bare soil, particularly on slopes and especially after disturbing it during construction or other work. In the center is what we'd call a compost berm. It's exactly that. It's a specifically shaped pile at the edge of a site or at the points of runoff to contain. They can function somewhat like silt fence, but after that construction stage can be very easily raked into the landscape and planted into. So it's much easier to maintain following site closure. And then in the bottom left are what we call compost filter socks. They can be used individually or in series, as is shown there. They can help hold banks as retaining, but they're also used in a lot of edge of site applications as check dams or ways to hold back water and slowly filter sediment before that water more slowly passes through it on the other side. And we'll get into a little more detail in the following slides. So this is on the right, the image shows what that type of compost would often look like. So trying to describe that as a more mulchy, carbon-rich, and fibrous compost, typically made of leaf and yard debris and wood chips, things of that nature, rather than what a lot of us are familiar with as more manure-based or fertile compost that we use in gardens and landscaping. So the intent here isn't to add a lot of additional fertility and nutrients. It's actually for the carbon-rich ingredients here to scavenge and filter and trap and hold them. The material functions slightly similar but different ways in those different practices. So in the berm and the sock, it's able to capture phosphorus, oils, or other things that physically attach to the particulate. The blanket is more of, again, a mulch or protection from that rain or exposure of the bare soil. And then in the sock itself, the combination of the coarse fibers both slow down the flow to disperse its energy and prevent it from continuing to scour and cause initial erosion, as well as the fine particulate, again, has a relative high surface area, so it can attach the phosphorus in particular, probably most important. Just another horror shot, what I would say is that chocolate milk that I've unfortunately seen color that the Missisquoi or Rock River has been at times. Clay soils in particular act like a drink mix, and that really fine small particulates can stay suspended and attach into phosphorus and carry it a long way. It doesn't settle out like larger particles like sand or gravel do and perhaps only move to the next sandbar or gravel bar downstream. Those suspended clay sediments can keep floating even at low velocities and make it from quite a ways up in the watershed all the way down to the lake. So again, there's the silt fence, which we've seen at construction sites all of my life, but unfortunately they're difficult to install properly, or they're just used in places where the water flows overwhelm them. And part of that is managing the upslope area to have that soil soak in better, but part of it is using different edge of field or edge of sites practices like the filter socks. So the next few slides are other illustrations of how these have been applied. The compost blankets, again, they have come out of a blower truck or with a hose that looks like what people have done for hydro seeding. It uses a little more of a dry mix of compost, but it allows more efficiently to apply this than trying to rake it out manually. We don't have too many projects of this scale in Vermont, but we do have a lot of sloped areas and a number of commercial and transportation projects where this could be applicable. The filter socks, as we've highlighted, are alternative to the silt fence, but can be integrated as well at the top of the slope to slow down flow coming over the top, then also at the toe of the slope before it enters the ditch. And we've got a couple more slides on that coming up. This illustration is a good way to show that with a little more labeling. So you've got the top of the field or whatever upslope area. The compost berm or compost sock functions to then disperse that energy horizontally and not have that water gain momentum and power and erosion scouring capacity. If that water was just run to the right, to the down of the hill, it would very easily cut a groove in a gully into the bank and lead sometimes to bank failures. The layer of compost is that compost blanket, mulching and protecting the soil surface, and then the berm at the bottom as an additional filter before the receiving waters. Just to call out a couple details with soil, sometimes those soil particles literally roll and get tumbling and then are part of that scouring action. The combined water and sediment can scour out the down areas and make that initial rill into a larger gully. With the compost, with those different particle sizes, particularly those fibrous pieces, it kind of overlaps or knits together and it, again, disperses the energy of rainfall and allows it to infiltrate and not build up that stream as readily. Just a cross section of the berm. The idea is if that water coming at it from the right is able to pool up, it slows its energy down. Some of the sediment can start to drop out, and then the berms are designed, or at least the material in there is intended to be able to pass through slowly dropping out some of the pollutants, but then weeping through some of the moisture on the other side at a slow velocity, reducing the erosion potential. Very similar to the compost socks, just basically you fill the mesh tube with that same material. The runoff, it probably can handle higher flow, which gives it strength to handle higher flows without washing out the berm. So these are also used in check dams in ditches to create a series of step pools, again, slowing down the velocity of the water. And I like these slides because they show it in practice, and the flexibility of the socks, quite different from a silt fence, is that it can vary with the topography or the terrain. So using those grade stakes, you can tamp it in close and prevent breaches. So in this case, it was installed very well. It pools up that water, gives it time to weep through on the other side, and leaves at least the majority of the sediment inside the intended work area, disturbed area. This pile on the left is also noteworthy. For years, topsoil stockpiles were often left untended, and now at least you see people putting silt fence up around them. But this again is even better in terms of resisting slumping and being able to hold that back and not have that soil leave the site. A couple good images of the compost socks or blankets being used on hillsides and slopes. You can see, if you look closely, that there's both a sock at the top and the bottom of the image on the left, again, to slow down any water that might come from the upslope forested or other area, and then pack in the or be able to catch anything that may drift at the bottom of the site. For longer slopes, you can break up the distances by putting a series of socks across the slope. A lot of these images are from other states, but certain institutions or facilities have started to use compost filter socks when closing out or revegetating a construction site. In particular, University of Vermont has been striving for the LEED, I believe it's Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. So this is another way to improve the environmental performance of the campus and facilities. So some of this is being applied locally. Some other examples, I think the one on the left is at Giroux Compost in Waterbury, basically a swale at the edge of a steep driveway that heads down to Route 2. The filter socks, again, slow down runoff that may come off of the driveway areas and capture that sediment in those various filter socks before spilling out onto the road or entering a drainage and heading into the nearby Winooski River. I think the middle picture is Jamie Tibbetts, some of you know, putting some filter socks as check dams. We did a series of demonstration projects in recent years in Highgate and Franklin and Enosburg and Fairfield. I can't picture where this one is particular, but again, a lot of these dirt roads around our communities can be sources of sediment, and this is a way to catch it in the channels and extend the life of the ditch networks. And then the last picture is the compost filter socks on the right. So again, at the edge of a construction site, be able to capture any potential runoff before it gets into the roadside drainage. So those sectors that we kind of talked about at the beginning of the middle of this presentation are where we have a lot of agricultural fields that drain or have points of drainage or runoff into our roadside ditch network. Again, this is that period in spring where tillage has happened, planting of corn silage may or may not have happened at this point, but essentially when the corn is up high enough to canopy over the soil and disperse the impact of raindrops to break up and impact the soil surface. So these compost filter socks were installed essentially as check dams at the edge of the field to try to slow down the flow of the high clay soils into the ditch. And then once into the ditch, an opportunity to block up a couple of the points as well. This eventually drains into the Rock River, which is certainly one of the higher phosphorus loaded watersheds in this region. But as you can see, even this is not a perfect solution. Even these got overwhelmed. The oozy clay worked its way by, and that's where I'll emphasize this again, but it takes multiple practices. If there's other practices that could also help that soil in the field be more resilient and absorb more of the precipitation, that would make these practices even more effective. The other thing a lot of people think about is when they put new driveways or roads that intersect with our paved or dirt municipal roads. So the picture at the right shows some sediment that's swept around from a driveway to the left and washed into the road system and likely is heading to a storm drain or some other exit, and then ultimately into our watersheds and towards Lake Champlain. So the different ways that we can stabilize the site and then capture those edge of site flows, that giving that temporary surface protection, reestablish vegetation, and then get that infiltration in is going to be a benefit to our municipal projects as well. The V-Trans compost blanket trial on Route 15 refers to a steep slope as you leave Hardwick to the east. There was a big roadside that needed to be stabilized. A lot of the bank used traditional heavy stone riprap, and another section used the compost blankets. The compost blanket section is now well revegetated and is typically less costly than importing all that stone and all the heavy equipment required to do it. So hopefully we'll see some more trials and demonstrations and routine application of that in the future. Some other examples of these products in use. Thanks, Kent, for sharing some images of local projects putting in rain gardens. I believe a lot of folks are familiar with these, but again, they have to do with creating small areas of retention and infiltration that are ideally aesthetically attractive and easier to maintain. They can take the drainage off of roofs, parking lots, or other impervious surfaces and turn them into a lovely garden. So the idea of we've made our communities more beautiful, we've added some vegetation and aesthetically pleasing areas, but they're points for that water to soak in rather than keep running off. A lot of the specifications on the soil mixes creating this are high in organic matter. As Deb referred to before, that organic matter helps with that sponge-like and soil moisture, the moisture retention properties of the soil. So they're typically, there's certain soils are often specified for different parts of these basins or rain gardens, depending on their size and how intensely they need to be engineered. But again, that organic matter is often provided through compost and is part of the package. Other applications, people may be doing this already in many cases, but planting a tree in dense compacted soil is really going to limit that root penetration and the success of that tree, and ultimately its success to prevent erosion and pump up, transpirate that moisture back into the atmosphere. So putting compost and other high organic matter soil around that can help the vegetation get established, and also mulch around the area to prevent give some weed suppression. I like this example of a residential. I think a lot of historically people treated their lawns when they needed to improve it or create a new one by putting on seed fertilizer and then maybe a little hay mulch. When really a lot of these soils don't need additional fertilizer or nutrients. What they need is that organic matter that had been disturbed or broken down when the lot was cleared if there was a lot of traffic or compaction, either by people or equipment. And I believe this was a 1/4 inch top dressing, maybe a 1/2 inch of top dressing of finely screened compost that worked in to the soil. And a few months later, a much better established lawn that's probably a lot softer to walk on too. All right, next slide here is actually in Enosburg. So a few years back, there was some demonstrations done on applying compost to the athletic fields along near Enosburg Falls High School. This was not a random act of farmer terrorism of applying manure on the field. It was actually composted manure. There is far more refined equipment out there used at golf courses and athletic fields for turf management that can put on precision application rates. Yet, just trying to get her done in Vermont style. Did some test strips working with Paul Stanley with and without an aerator tool. These athletic fields get a lot of compaction from soccer and other sports. What we learned is we probably applied it too thick. It actually matted a little bit, but ultimately the grass really came back well, and it was a nice soft part of the field. So that's much more widely used in New York State. Chuck Dupree, who's another part of the team working on these modules, does a lot of work with schools and other facilities to use compost in turf and athletic field management in New York and the Northeast. Here's the like thinking on levels of what we can do in our own homes and settings. Compost use in gardens, it's probably what many of us are already familiar with. It's going to add nutrients and that beneficial biology into the soil. And it does different things for different soil types. For those sandy, really well-drained soils, it's going to add really that moisture retention and nutrient retention values and properties. And then in heavy soil, like a clay, it can help break apart those tight soils that can clump together, be very dense and hard to get either your tools or roots down into. So working compost into the clay soil really helps with that aggregation and gets more porosity into the soil. Good example of someone taking their small cover cropped planting bed, and one of the ways they get their cover crop to reincorporate into the soil a little better is adding compost to it at the same time. The last point here at the bottom left, Deb alluded to this before, but if you are seeing diseased plants or insect infested, again, your own backyard compost pile is a great way to recycle a lot of things, but don't have the expectation that it's going to get to that temperature and level of activity where you can be sure that it's broken down those plant or animal pathogens and killed those weed seeds. So it's a rare backyard pile that gets that hot, but a lot of the commercial facilities are well set up to do that and are required to monitor the process so that they hit those time and temperature requirements. While again, we don't have a huge phosphorus load per acre in these forested landscapes, we have a lot of forested landscape in the Missisquoi and other northern lake basins. So we do have areas that are sometimes heavily impacted, like landings, some of the tank house areas and sugaring operations and so forth, where bare soil is created and then is that source of phosphorus and sediment. And sometimes in the alpine environment, it's also hitting into more sensitive and fragile streams and can lead to that chain reaction of soil erosion, bank erosion, and in-channel erosion. So pretty important to stabilize things in this area. There are some specs used from other states. My understanding, this is not yet widely adopted in Vermont, but there are other states and regions in the country that are using compost as part of restoring areas near and adjacent to abandoned roads or logging roads and landings. Just getting near the end here, in compost and agriculture, we talked about this before, closing the loop, taking a lot of these organic matter and nutrient resources that historically, or at least in recent decades, we've just thrown in a landfill and really ended the resource loop there. So if we can get more of these back into our resource cycle, take advantage of that, use local materials for that soil building and fertility building. There's concerns about plastic and glass. That takes us all being diligent on how we source separate and how different processors along the chain handle those materials. There's certainly guidance and rules and regulations around pathogens, everything from Salmonella to E. coli, heavy metals, and so forth, that we want to use the right inputs for the right end use of the product. And some of the other modules will go more depth into that topic. Broadly, the finer particle composts are used in more of germination or potting soil mixes, where coarse fractions can be used, whether it's for erosion control and revegetation or just broad applications for in growing crops and hay. There are increasing use of some of those compost-based best management practices in ag settings as well. In a field at a point of runoff, as check dams in swales or ditches, and other areas along roads that are disturbed, and trying to create a buffer and filtration point. Thinking about phosphorus, as that's such a key aspect of the total maximum daily load agreement between the state of Vermont and the EPA, and really the still massive amounts of reductions that are needed in the 20-year plan, particularly in some of these northern lake watersheds. Let's remember how phosphorus moves. There's already some resident in the lake, but we are still loading a lot from our watersheds. We have these areas of the source, whether that's the soil in a field or someone's yard or up in the forest. But phosphorus is sticky. It attaches to the soil particles. It's not like nitrogen that can leach or volatilize into the air or down into deep groundwater. Phosphorus is typically attached to the soil particles or manure particles and carried away into these streams and rivers through runoff. So reducing that runoff, reducing those flows, is a big piece of the puzzle. So if we can infiltrate more of that rainfall, which is getting more in larger storms and so forth, if we can improve our soil water holding capacity through increasing organic matter, we've got a good opportunity to make a difference. And some great stats here in my mind. 1% increase in organic matter in that top 6 inches can hold another 27,000 gallons of water per acre. That's a huge sponge, and there's in many soils as little as 2% organic matter after years of tillage or other practices that break down that organic matter and oxidize it. So if we can get those soils up to 4, 5, 6%, we can have a significant additional amount of water holding capacity and reduce the size of those peak flows through our streams and rivers. Just fun facts in terms of a healthy soil can hold 20 times its weight in water. I mean, that's, again, the sponge in your sink. We can really hold on to it. And with that porosity and aggregate structure, it can also, in the medium and micropores, the meso and micropores, hold on to water where it's not draining through the soil anymore, but can still be accessed by plant roots in those periods of drought. And there's some great examples. Gieschwander comes to mind of that being true in practice. And the last piece of this phosphorus loading is it's really storm driven. I believe the statistic is still true, but the majority of the phosphorus loads to the lake occur in 15 or less days out of the year. So it's those big storms, it's the big snow melts at the end of winter that carries most of that phosphorus through our watersheds and into the lake. So we have to think about, when we're trying to manage phosphorus, we've got to manage for those big storms. It's not the everyday loading of phosphorus, at least in these more rural watersheds. It's when we're seeing those precipitation events. So that's what our practices have to be trying to address. And bringing it back to compost is not the magic solution all by itself. It's part of a larger multi-barrier approach or a system-wide approach. So really protecting the soil. You need those cover crops. You need those rotations, reducing the intensity of tillage, all great strategies to protect that soil surface, allow it to still be a sponge. And before we get into the discussion, this is kind of the way to wrap up these slides is a lot of these practices have been designed for, in these practices, I mean those detention basins at the edge of parking lots and developed areas, farmstead practices for barnyards and other things. They're all designed for what we saw as the 50-year or 25-year storm previously. We are clearly seeing that frequency of large storm events increasing. So we have to design for that in the future. So we need to do this quickly. We've made awesome progress with a lot of things. There's so many people working on improving practices, but just the reality check, we have a long way to go if we're going to protect the lake and not have algae blooms be a routine thing that we deal with every year. And that last point at the bottom, the compliance mindset, isn't necessarily bad entirely. New regulations have made a big difference. As we mentioned, the stormwater, there's increasing regulation on farms through large farms, medium farm, down to small farm operations that require them to do nutrient management and erosion control and a series of practices. But again, that's not going to get us to those goals of the total maximum daily load phosphorus reductions. It's really starting to think of, we need to restore more functions in the landscape and regenerate. So that's what we're advocating for here, is to approach some of this work with a different mindset.
Thank you so much, Brian. Just very quickly before we move to conversation, I just want to throw out a couple resources: the compostingvermont.org soil builders website, Friends of Northern Lake Champlain and Franklin County Natural Resource Conservation District's website as well. There will be on the soil builders page, we will be linking out to our partners here, as well as some other resources. So check that out. And then my contact information you can also find, of course, at compostingvermont.org. And one last thank you to our funders. And now I'm going to actually stop sharing the screen so we can have more just sort of face-to-face conversation. I think we're a small enough group. If people want to share their cameras, feel free. We had a number of good questions come in, but I think I'll kick it, Kent, maybe to you first to just share your reflections, and Lauren, I'm not sure which of you want to go first, and maybe we'll just have a little bit of discussion, and I'll be looking through the questions. Some of them were pretty technical, but we can dig into those as well.
Yeah, I don't really have any prepared remarks. I really enjoy getting caught up on the uses of compost in the field. I was really curious about how it could actually be applied in the field. I can see some areas where we could have used these products in the work that we do. We've done some lake shore restoration work where we've used coconut husk logs, which may be more fibrous and maybe a more sturdy type structure than what these compost log or blankets would be. But I really don't know enough about those blankets, if that's the case or not. But it's certainly, it looks like something that could really enhance the work that we're trying to do. That gravel swale that you showed that I provided, it is a question about how are we going to vegetate that. The owner would like to simply have grass seed put down so he can mow it and bushwhack it. And that's kind of what we try to do, is we try to work with the owner and what their preferences are, and for site and on their own property. So yeah, I'm really glad to look at this tonight, and I'm really like to see what how your answers are for some of the questions. There's some pretty good questions thrown at you.
For sure.
I'll just jump in and add a couple other thoughts as well. I really appreciated the comments about the compliance mindset versus regenerative mindset. I think even within the compliance mindset, you know, there are ways to work around compliance too that I think sometimes save money and sometimes maybe don't lead to the best results in the end. And so going in with the intention to really take care of the landscape with any construction or earth moving project. You know, I was thinking about some of those silt fence pictures, and it really is one of those 15 days in Lake Champlain Basin. If you have bare soil on a construction project, you are contributing some problems. So it is important to make sure you're working on chunks of a project at any given time and maybe not leaving a whole landscape bare. And I am curious too, I know, Brian, you showed an image of the stream bank erosion, and I'm wondering, it kind of seems like working upstream of that stream bank with compost is the important piece so you don't get that heavy erosion. I'm curious if there are approaches with compost directly on a stream bank, if that's appropriate and what that might look like, because I know we've got some eroding streams in all of our neighborhoods. And I also appreciate the mention of all of the work that can be done with compost on agricultural lands. I think we think a lot about spreading compost or compost teas on land, but I love in agricultural ditches or in those swales using the compost as check dams. It seems like a really innovative approach that I hadn't seen before. So my two thoughts. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Brian, do you want to address her question about the upstream, and then we can get into some of the chat questions?
Yeah, I think you hit it right. The kind of the point to convey with that eroding stream bank is maybe in part it happened because it didn't have enough trees or a woody buffer to deflect the energy of the channel. But part of the issue was that there was so much power from a high flow generated from upstream, where if we had been able to soak more of that volume into the hundreds or thousands of acres upstream from there, that peak flow would likely be lower and have less scouring potential and likely wipe out less of our river banks. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The other part of the question you asked is, have people use these products in the stream banks themselves? Not that I've seen in Vermont, but I've seen pictures and articles and different trade magazines where more so in urban settings, like if there was a steep channelized, formerly rip-wrapped or stone line channel, that they would use the compost filter socks as a series of steps or terraces, both to provide that kind of physical protection against the soft soil of the bank against high flows, but then also to provide a setting for willows or other appropriate riparian plantings to be packed in there and eventually create a live growing vegetated stream bank channel. So, and then I know there's some other questions in the chat, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll just echo that it's really important to get that footing really sound, but there are applications. And again, although it's been said a number of times, I really just want to iterate, you need to use the right type of compost for the applications right on stream banks. You want to be really sure that it's mature compost, that it's stable, and that it's not the more high nutrient composts, because it is going to be, it's much more likely to have at least periods where it might be super saturated from higher flows. So you really want to just match the application to what you're trying to do. So some of the questions in chat here, I'm just going to start at the top. There's a lot about filter socks, and Brian or Deb, we can go round robin, or whoever wants to raise your hand or just jump in. So can filter socks be left on the site after construction, and what are they made of? And if you want me to take any of these, just let me know. But otherwise, I'll give you guys first.
I'll start just because I've done a couple demonstrations with them. And typically they are like a plastic mesh. They do have ones that are made of more natural materials like burlap or coir or hemp. But most of the ones out there, just for their strength and durability, are made of mesh plastic. So typically they could be left on site for years, but the ideal closeout of the site would be that you could slit open the filter sock and leave the ingredients, that mulchy compost, on the site and easily rake it in, and then have a relatively small volume of plastic trash that you need to dispose of. And just to contrast that to the standard silt fence application, it's considerably less plastic to have to deal with and throw out when properly closing out a site.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that one of the differences, and this was touched on in one of the soil builder sessions that was part of the Vermont Organics Recycling Summit. It's available on the CAV website. And we spent a bit of time actually talking about the different materials that compost socks are made of. And one of the benefits of having a really strong material, even if it is plastic, for the compost sock is that it doesn't degrade in light, and a lot of the silt fence material does. So when you do go back to remove it, you can slit it open and pull it out as single piece, as opposed to having tons of tiny bits of, chunks of plastic that already started degrading by the time you get back to pulling it out. And there are Jack Eaton, who was one of the presenters in that one, has been trying to get a pilot off the ground to actually then recycle that plastic into like making mats, like for other, so like what is the end use of that plastic? So a lot of folks who are engaged in this are trying to think full circle. We may not be quite there the whole time. But in that presentation, he does show some pictures and talk about some of the degradable compost socks and when to use them, because those might degrade in the course of a year or 2 years, and that may not be long enough to really get the vegetation established depending on where it is. So again, we're back to the right material for the right application. Deb, do anybody else want to chime in on that, or?
I don't have anything else to add, really.
And then I believe stakes maybe shouldn't go through the compost socks too directly. Brian, do you want to?
The mesh is pretty strong. So, and it's a trade-off of how many stakes you use. You can pin the stakes through putting them on either side. And probably in a low elevation setting, you could get away with just putting them on the downslope area. You're not worried about it being pushed. More so in a slope or area where you're going to expect the flows. The guidance was to put the stakes right through, and typically it doesn't start a tear and cause to a failure. But yeah, there's probably a balance there somewhere of the best way to do it.
Well, and it's just mainly just to keep them in place so they're not going to start drifting too. So,
yep.
Yeah.
So there's a question about the life expectancy of the compost sock. I think we addressed that a little bit. The ones that are the plastic mesh tubing can last for years, really.
And the other way to answer that question too is also what's its loading in terms of it being affected. If you have a completely bare 5-acre site that's just belching soil, those filter socks will eventually clog and blind and no longer be effective. So there are limits for sure. But yeah, they can, if it's at a reasonable rate, and there's a series of practices to protect the site and minimize erosion in the first place. It's just an extra barrier for capturing that sediment.
Yep. Okay, we have a question. Is there any concern about adding compost that may contain phosphorus onto the landscape where phosphorus is already an issue? Does phosphorus leach from the compost in these scenarios?
I don't think we have enough data to answer that absolutely. In general, the biggest benefit is the reduced amount of flow. So there were some studies done, I want to say it was in Iowa, where there is some phosphorus passing through. You can't say that no phosphorus passes through the filter socks, but the volume of runoff and the total phosphorus that left that site was significantly more from the site that didn't have these compost-based practices, just because that volume of runoff led to a higher total amount of phosphorus loss.
I was just going to add, this comes back to the question of using the right compost for the project. So if phosphorus is the issue, you want to think about, some of those coarser ones that have, from the yard debris as opposed to the manure-based ones. For example, a little coarser material could be that. And the other thing is there's a lot of different forms of phosphorus. And so the one that we, some are, and so the one fraction that probably is one we have to think about is the water soluble. That's actually going into the water, where there's some that are going to be bound very tightly and not. So.
Yeah, so it's important to look at the total P as well as that water extractable piece or portion of the phosphorus that's either in the compost or in the soil or, in both. It depends whether it's vegetated, like, or, if you put it in and then you get a big rainfall, it's going to be different than if it's, after it's been said and the vegetation has really come in. But I think the piece that Brian also talked about that's really important that people forget is just the sheer volume of water leaving that site, and the soil leaving the site with that water is so reduced. The other piece that I don't, and Deb, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we know as much as I would love to know. I don't know as much as I would love to know about the impact of the biology that you're adding and that you're feeding and that you're supporting by using compost, because there's a lot of different interactions with just by adding more life to that soil and how that interacts with the nutrients.
Well, and that life is going to basically immobilize and pull a lot of the nutrients out and hold it there. Yeah. So that's a benefit. So, because phosphorus is one of the molecules, that's essential for life. It's in all of our, it's in DNA and it's in all the membranes of cells, etc.
Yeah. So looking at it, just like if you put a jar of it and super saturate it, you're going to get really different results of what the phosphorus is that might come out than if you look at it within the ecosystem.
And a lot of times the analyses we get from the labs are just focusing on the inorganic phosphorus, and not very few really look at the organic phosphorus, which would be the part that is associated with the biology. Yeah. And I think in the future, we want to kind of look at both to get a more comprehensive view.
We are working with Vermont DEC stormwater folks to start thinking about that water extractable phosphorus in addition, in terms of the limitations and what the recommendations are. So we have a question about a Vermont biochar manufacturer has experimented using biochar in a very similar setup to compost socks. I don't know that much about that, but it's just, oh, good, Brian, comment.
And hi, Jim. But I believe this is Green State Biochar, who I'm familiar, and maybe there's more than one, but they did basically an edge of barnyard or farmstead filter using biochar to capture that manure-laden runoff. I think it is similar in the sense that the biochar has very high surface area. So similar to how we discussed the fine particulate in the filter stocks is where you get those attachment sites for phosphorus in particular. The biochar generally functioned in that way. I don't have all the data of how it functioned, but I know they're trying to do that. They're based in Barton, and maybe the farm they worked with was over in Walden or more the Northeast Kingdom part of the state. So that's as much as I can say about it. But the concept of that high surface area to attach to the phosphorus that's flowing through is at least an analogy in the approach. And ultimately it then can be cleaned out and reincorporated into a more appropriate part of the landscape after you've captured or tried to treat that concentrated flow.
Good, thank you, Brian. Let's see. Can residents or just general consumers purchase compost socks, or are they more for municipal use? Go ahead, Brian.
I wish they were more locally available. We tried to kind of stimulate that with that demonstration a few years ago. Bates offered, did offer a couple pallets, but the folks who were trying to make their own over near St. Johnsbury had other enterprises as well and didn't stick with it. So the only person I'm aware of, and Natasha, you probably know better than me, is Jack Eaton with Certified Erosion Control in New Hampshire. But it seems like there's an opportunity for his company to grow more into this area, or other companies to get into that
And
space.
Prescott's, is it Prescott's?
EJ Prescott.
EJ
Yep.
Prescott carries the Filtrex filter socks.
Okay.
And you can buy it by the pallet or by the length. I went in for a demonstration that I was doing just to bring it with me, and bought like a 5-foot section, and then you just tie off the end. And so so you can buy them at places. I mean, I just walked in and said, hey, I need compost sock, and they came out. But
they're down near the airport in South Burlington, EJ Prescott. So.
Right. I didn't know if they were anywhere else.
There's
I think
one in Barrie near Montpelier.
Okay. Yeah.
And maybe one other location.
So they carry them, at least. It's but it is Filtrex, so it's not like Vermont made. I will say that it is good to just do your due diligence. In some of the work that I've done with VTrans, with our Department of Transportation, they did some work. I think it was in the Stowe area, and it was a white mesh, and it was not, it was something that someone put together, and I'm not sure who it was, and they didn't remember who it was. This was a number of years before I started working with the association, but it ended up that it was not stable compost. It wasn't a finished compost. It did not perform. And unfortunately, when things like that happen, people are like, oh, compost socks are horrible. That didn't work at all. And that is not the message we want to be sending, which is part of why we're doing a lot of education around different types of compost for different applications. And in the overview best management practice module 3, that's available on the website as well, it gets really much more into the specifications and stability of finished compost, and why that's important, and what to be looking for, what to be asking from the producers of your compost. So just, I guess, a little word of caution in terms of making sure you know what you're using, if it's not like a branded certified source, or from someone who you can go talk to, who made it and can provide you the tests done on the compost that is filling that sock. Because the last thing you want is to be trying to do the right thing and invest in that product and have it fail. Let's see, we're right at 8:30. We have 2 more questions. Do folks have a few more minutes? Are you interested in hanging on, or do we have a hard stop? I'm happy to stay for a few more minutes if I got some thumbs up. All right, and if you do need to drop off, we totally understand, and this will be posted so you can listen in afterwards. So this question, I like this question. It seems that the interventions really deal with the top layer of the soil. We're not digging down to install the compost. Does the benefit of compost reach lower down into the soil layer if lower layers have poor aggregation? Do you want to take that one, Deb?
I'm going to say, the applications of compost are really going to be at the surface, but the impact at deeper layers is going to come through the plants. So if you're getting that compost in that soil to really favor plants and root penetration, that's where you're really going to get your impact deeper. You get those roots down deeper, that's going to add organic matter in those deeper layers, and also just support the biology there. So I think of it as, we're not, management wise, not putting it there, but if we do it, nature's going to do it for us, right? If we're getting the good, healthy plants, and we get that infiltration. And you get that looser soil, it's going to allow more of the soil organisms like that you want, that, to actually help open and break, they're kind of little engineers too, in terms of adding porosity in those deeper soils. And you see, I know we have the earthworms around here are mostly invasive, but they are a type of animal that does have a lot of organic material right around their casting, in the drillosphere, kind of their area. So, and they're a means of getting some of this material down deep.
Great.
I will just add quickly, I think that's definitely the case for most of these applications. There's going to be a handful of situations where you're dealing with a highly compacted construction site that's just been, suddenly it's a 6 or 12 inches of a brick. So in those extreme cases, you may need some mechanical tillage to incorporate. But yeah, nature generally feeds the soil from the surface, and letting nature do the work is certainly the preferred, except in those extreme settings when you're restoring an old building site or an old parking lot or some other example where there's other factors at play.
And then maybe even constructing that as layers and some kind of stratification if that's going to be an issue, right? You're putting that back.
Yep. And Jim just added root exudates are also a source of nutrients deeper in the soil. Okay, and the last question we have here so far is, after proper installation, what are some of the maintenance concerns when using compost blankets and berms? Is it simply expected that protective vegetation cover will sustain improvement, or should it be expected to add more organic material? Brian?
I'll say it's pretty site specific. Ideally, that the ideal would just be the vegetation is able to get a good establishment, be further protection for the soil surface, and again, itself add more organic matter over time. But there are going to be sites that maybe have a lot of traffic. Again, those athletic fields or just places on campuses or municipal facilities that just have a lot of people walking over them, or equipment after a construction project, or another other disturbance where some supplemental organic matter may be justified. So it's kind of it depends answer to a good question.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It really depends on the use, I think. And one thing that we didn't really talk about that is covered in some of our other, especially in the landscaping, the landscape architect focused one, is that often the blankets can be mixed with seed before you're blowing the compost blanket material on. You can also pre-seed what you're filling. So you can go to and buy pallets of like pre-filled compost sock, but you can also get the sock itself and fill it with a blower hose on site from a truck. And so that is another way that you can pre-seed those. It's in place, and then it starts seeding through that. So so there's just a bunch of different ways that a bunch of different types of applications, depending on, you can take into account the site, the history, the intended future use, and choose accordingly. But I know from my yard, which when we bought the house where we are in Heinsberg, it was in horrible quality. And I just little by little keep adding, top dressing with compost in sections. And I fully expect to have to go back and reapply at some point. We didn't talk about this, but I will put a little plug in for doing soil tests. It's a great way to know where you're at and what your soil needs, and to gear the application rates as well as the type of material you're adding much more specifically, and have a higher success rate on your if you're doing it on your property or anywhere. But I think a lot of homeowners forget kind of to do a soil test, and that can provide a lot of information. Great. We're just getting some thanks in the chat. So I think we're going to wrap up here, but thanks once again to Deb and Brian for presenting and sharing their knowledge. Thank you, Lauren and Kent, and to your organizations for partnering with us. So yeah, thanks to all the participants for spending your evening with us, and stay tuned for more workshops, the soil deep dive among them. Have a good evening, you guys.
Thank you, everyone.